I don't think you fully understood how cause and effect works. And but we do still agree, even though you think that we don't agree. And I'm going to explain why, utilizing what you spoke about, Jerome. Now, and I do appreciate your comment. So I understand what you're saying, that the law of cause and effect couldn't possibly work because the fact that our ancestors, because I looked at your page and I recognize that you're black like me, but our ancestors were conquered. Our ancestors were enslaved for over 200 plus years. Our ancestors struggled through Jim Crow. They struggled through redlining and all the different things that you mentioned, and we still struggle with over policing and things of that nature. You're absolutely correct. But I want you to look at it understand it from this point. The law of cause and effect is still in place simply because one of the things that I stated briefly in the previous video is the fact that you can be and become susceptible to another person's will that is stronger than yours, which would make you the effect of that person's will. Generally, a person in today's world has more power of causation than a person who was living during Jim Crow, a person who was living during slavery. Any persons who are living in a conquered state has less power of causation in one sense because they are the effects of someone else's causation that was stronger than theirs at a certain time frame and has continued to linger on, much as the things that you stated have continued to linger on from the causation of conquering Africa, conquering the Americas, and conquering many of the islands by the European. But to fully grasp cause and effect, you must realize that if during our ancestors being conquered and being enslaved and going through Jim Crow and so on and so forth, and into the modern age of the things that we endure, that if you look at it on the pole, we were at a low vibration during those time frames. Now, in order to change that vibration, it would take more energy than what it took for you to be the effects of someone else's causation. Meaning that in order for slavery to end in America, it took the larger stone being thrown into the pond of the Civil War. It took the 1804 Haitian Revolution, which was a larger stone thrown more forcefully into the pond so that the ripple effects would go all the way across the pond. Comparing that to whereas just running away from for your freedom, it is a stone that's being thrown in the pond, but it is a smaller stone which has less of a ripple effect that may not and does not in our history reach the other side of the pond to give you the full effects of freedom and equality. A larger stone and force was then later thrown in with the 1960s 1960s protest and by black Americans and others who joined in who were allies. And then that gave us more of a ripple effect of bringing about a more equal state, a more free state. And although we are in the effects, if you're my age, I'm 52, then we are living the effects of that larger stone that they threw in that caused a greater ripple effect than the stones of running away and escaping. Um, because although I appreciate those who did run away, those who did rebel in those senses, it did not create an effect that alleviated the causation of being enslaved. So if you want to change something in your life, if you want to change an effect in your life, you have to exert more energy in order to change it. My grandmother used to tell me in relationships, and you have to do twice as whatever you did to get her, you have to do twice as much to keep her, right? Meaning that all the energy that you put into getting the woman or getting the person, right? Once you've achieved that, the ripple effects of what you did to get her starts to wane as time goes on. But in order to keep her, you now have to throw in larger stones. You have to throw in stones with more force in order to continue to regenerate those ripple effects and make them larger and larger so that they completely encompass the relationship, instead of how many relationships start to default into a comfortability zone because the ripples began to wane. So when we speak on over policing in our communities, if all we do is complain about it, if all we do is sit back and not learn from it, then of course the ripple effects begin to wane and we can regress back into a state. Now, in order for us to truly have freedom in America, a large stone has to be thrown in, but unfortunately, and that is unfortunate because the mentality of most people of color in America, black people especially, those whose families were part of enslavement, those who are identified by the government as black, we have and we've gotten comfortable in what state we're in. In order for us to change that, we have to throw in much larger stones, and those stones is not necessarily revolution, but those stones have to be things where we are teaching our children to do not just 10% better than what we have done in our lives, but to teach our children to do 100% better than what we have done in our lives. A perfect example of this would be how the immigrants who come to the Americas are coming from countries where everybody else was comfortable in the fact that this is the impoverished and this is the wealthy. Whereas in America, those few that come, because it is actually, when you look at the number, very few leave their country and come to America in comparison to those who are comfortable in their poverty. And if they were picking bananas or cotton or digging rows and trenches and things of that nature, and if their children just gets a job doing the same thing but with a little bit better pay, then that's comfortable and they're fine with that small advancement, which keeps them impoverished in their country. But the American psyche is different in the sense that impoverishment in America is nowhere near the same as impoverishment in some other countries. So therefore we have become relaxed in the same way that they are, and only push our children to do 10% better. Your parents didn't own a house, so your parents only push you to own a house. Your parents worked in the plant as a plant worker. They pushed you to become a supervisor in the plant. But instead of pushing you to becoming the owner of the plant or to becoming a vice president in the operations of the corporation to which is owned by the plant. So we don't push as much. I grew up with and didn't learn anything about finances and saving and investments. And so the natural thing to do would be, oh, I'm going to buy a house, unlike my mother did. I'm going to save a little bit of money, unlike my mother did. Instead, I should, and I do, teach my children that from the time that you begin working, you invest in something steady like an S&P fund, so that by the time you're 50, 60 years old, you have over $1 million, up to 4 million, 5 million, 6 million in that account, and not living on a retirement, because that was the expectation that I grew up with, that you work for a company 20, 30 years and you get the retirement. And so we don't push our kids, we don't teach our kids, we don't go out and gain the knowledge to be able to teach them how to do that. And we don't give them the knowledge of how to build a business and own the company, instead of just merely working for the company, just at a slightly higher level than our parents did. So the law of cause and effect is still there, even when you're being the effect instead of being the causation. It's just that in order to change it at a drastic level, much like the immigrants do, they may be still working in the laundromat or the plant, but they push their children much harder to do 1,000% better than them, to become the doctors, the lawyers, to become the engineers, to become the scientists, to own the companies, to own the community, own the housing, own multiple housings. They push them harder to make a greater impact, and that is why we don't see as much energy going towards us changing it. We agree.